Hi there, today we're going to analyze some very common traps that we can get in the Englund Gambit, which is a position that we get after the moves d4 and e5. So this video is going to be very helpful if you play the Englund Gambit, but also if you face it. The Englund Gambit is fairly popular. It is the fourth most common move that can be played against d4, so if you played a lot of games with the move d4, it is very likely that you face this gambit. So I'm gonna teach you how to play against the traps that black can play, and if you played the Englund Gambit, then I'm gonna tell you what I consider the best line that you can go for as black. I'm going to mainly focus on white taking on e5, which is the most logical approach, just taking the pawn. Here black has the idea to take on d4 and then develop with knight to c6, for example after c4, black simply takes and then develops with knight to c6, black is doing perfectly fine here. If white goes d5, then here black can easily develop the bishop to c5. This is a very common idea in the Englund Gambit, as we'll see. Or if white develops with knight to f3, here black can simply play the move e4 attacking the knight. Black is already gaining space on the center, so this position is already quite good for black. So here after e5 and d takes e5, we're going to cover black's common alternatives and all the traps that black may play. The first is knight to c6, naturally developing and attacking the pawn e5, and here we're going to play knight to f3, which is by far the most natural move and most common move. Bishop to f4 is possible, but this is a bit less flexible because the knight is going to develop to f3 anyways, and defending the pawn with f4 is not very strong because black is very often willing to go d6, and after pawn takes and bishop takes, this pawn on f4 is not well placed, just blocking the bishop, and now black can develop quite quickly. For example, after e4, black can play something like queen to e7, or first give a check and then go queen to e7, and there's already pressure against the pawn e4. And if white goes e5, black can simply counterattack this pawn by going f6, since the pawn e5 is pinned. So after knight to c6 and knight to f3, here the most common way for black to continue is to go queen to e7, and in this position white very often tries to keep this pawn and goes bishop to f4, which is not a bad move, but as we see, there's a lot of traps that black can go for, and white can keep the advantage, but white has to be very precise. So after bishop to f4, I'm going to show you another line that I suggest, but let's cover the move bishop to f4. Here black has this very tricky move, queen to b4, forking the king and the bishop, and here white has to be very precise in order to keep the advantage. So here there are two ways to defend the bishop. Queen to d2 is one of them, but this is already a bad move because after queen takes b2, planning to capture the rook, the only way to defend it is queen to c3, but after bishop to b4, black is spinning and winning the queen. So in this position, white has to go for the move bishop to d2. Just want to mention another tricky line, which is knight to c3. Here this seems to hang the bishop, but after knight to d5, white is attacking the queen and planning to take on c7. But this position is actually quite tricky, so I don't suggest that you go for as white, because after queen to e4, knight takes, we get a fork, and after knight takes a8, white is winning the exchange, but this knight is going to fall because it's going to be trapped. Black can start getting some material back, so this position remains quite complicated. So bishop to d2 is the move for white to fight for the advantage, and after queen takes b2, now white again has to be quite careful. If white goes bishop to c3, here again the move bishop to b4 is actually quite strong, pinning this bishop. If white takes on b4, after knight takes e2 is going to be just very strong, in addition to the idea of capturing on a2. And here the most natural way to continue is queen to d2, but this also fails after bishop takes and queen takes, otherwise black captures on a1, but here we have this very nice move, queen to c1 checkmate. So after queen takes b2, knight to c3 is the best move in the position. Black can continue with this idea of bishop to b4. If black goes for knight to b4, then after knight to d4 we are in time to defend and then start counterattacking. For example, here the move c5 is not particularly strong because after rook to b1, now we drive the queen away from c2, and then we can start attacking. For example, after knight d to b5, queen to a5 and a3, we are simply kicking black's pieces back. And now we also have ideas to go knight to d5 and be the one attacking. So here bishop to b4 is the trickiest move in the position. And here again, the only move that keeps an advantage for white is the move rook to b1 with the same idea to drive black's pieces away. For example, here after queen to a3, knight to d5 is a very strong move, simply counter-attacking and also having this idea of attacking on c7. But even in this position after rook to b1, I just want to mention a queen sacrifice that black might play in this position. It was actually played by strong grandmaster Amman Hambleton, which is taking on c3. This is objectively not sound, but it is still quite tricky when you play. So here after queen takes, and bishop takes, knight to d2 is the only move to keep the material advantage. And now black might have ideas to take on e5 either with the bishop or with the knight. Now there's an idea to go knight to c4. With correct play, white can prevent this. For example, e3 controls the c4 square. White gets an advantage in this position, but this position can be a bit tricky, at least when you play games with quick time controls. So after queen to e7, the move bishop to f4 should lead to an advantage for white, but as we see, the road is full of traps. So if you don't want to memorize all these lines, which I wouldn't suggest probably because this is a line in the Englund Gambit, that is the fourth most common reply that black can play against d4. So if you want to play a very simple idea, one of them is to go knight to c3 with the idea of going knight to d5, but a move that I have been playing that I really like because it is quite simple and in my view quite annoying for black is just to simply give back the pawn and develop. Here go g3 and after knight takes, simply develop, and black already has to be very careful to hold the balance. So here taking on f3 is a logical move, and now we simply plan to castle, and this queen on e7 is actually not well placed. First of all, it is blocking the bishop on f8, and we might also have ideas to attack it after knight to c3 and knight to d5. For example, here knight to f6 is a logical developing move. Now here we can simply castle, and now we might have ideas to go c4, bishop to g5, and knight to c3. Black still has problems in this position, black still has to equalize here. So after queen to e7, if you want to play simple moves as white and still keep at the very least a slight advantage, I suggest that you go for g3 and bishop to g2. So let's now analyze another trap that black might play in the Englund Gambit. After d takes e5 instead of knight to c6, bishop to c5 is another common continuation. Now here we're going to play knight to f3. This is a move that we're going to play pretty much in all lines. And here black has the idea of going d6. And here the most common move is to take on d6. I will suggest another move later on, but after d takes e6, here black plays the tricky knight to e7, and the most common move in this position is to take this knight, which is actually quite bad because after bishop takes f2, we drive the king away from e1, king takes is forced, and after queen takes, black is winning a queen. So after d6, pawn takes, and knight to e7, white can actually avoid this trap by going bishop to f4, simply developing. Black might insist with this idea by going knight b to c6, again, taking the knight is bad because bishop takes f2 wins the queen, but here we can play the move e3, and now there's the idea to capture the knight. Black will normally take with the pawn, and now we can simply continue developing, for example, knight b to d2 and bishop to e2. So here black doesn't have compensation for the pawn, even though black has slightly better development. We could play this position. Or probably even better here is to simply continue developing. Here I suggest that you play the move bishop to f4 because taking on e5 is not a big threat, so we can simply continue developing. After bishop to f4, I think that white is a healthy pawn up. For example, here taking on e5 is actually quite bad because now we can simply trade queens, and after knight takes, now we even plan to take on f7. So taking on e5 is not a good idea, but if black doesn't take on e5, black doesn't get compensation for the pawn. And another common idea that black can play in the Englund Gambit is to go d6 straight away. f6 is a similar idea, but I think that it's even worse because after f6, now black can't develop the knight to f6 easily. And here again, we don't want to take and help black develop. We're going to play a similar idea. We're going to play knight to f3. So against d6 or f6, now here we don't want to take on d6 because this would help black develop. But instead we're going to play knight to f3. But in any case, let me show you another common trap that we can get in this position. After taking on d6 and bishop takes d6, if white develops naturally by going knight to f3, knight to c6, and knight to c3, here black has an interesting idea, which is to develop on the queen side. Instead of going knight to f6, play the move bishop to g4 and then queen to e7. So here if white plays natural moves like e3 and after queen to e7, bishop to e2, now black can castle long, and if white is careless here and castles short, here white has to block the d file by going bishop to d2, even in this case, black already has good compensation for the pawn. But here, if white castles, black has this idea of a discover attack against the queen by going bishop takes h2, or black can first take on f3 and then sacrifice the bishop, but after king takes, rook takes d1, black is winning white's queen. So here after the move d6, white has to be a bit careful because black gets very quick development and in some lines very good compensation. So here what I suggest that you play is the move knight to f3. And this move d6 is actually the line that I suggest that you play as black if you play the Englund Gambit. I think that black might not get full compensation for the pawn, but it is probably black's best continuation. So actually I don't suggest that you play the Englund Gambit in all of your games as black, but you can play it occasionally, and the move d6 is probably black's best try. So here taking on d6 is actually quite risky for white. That's why I suggest if you play as white to go for knight to f3. And in this position, again, taking on e5 is actually quite bad because after queen takes and knight takes, with just straight pieces, white gets an extra pawn, and now there's even the idea to take on f7. So here in this position, I think that the best way for black to continue is to go knight to c6, putting more pressure on e5, inviting white to trade, and here again, white doesn't want to help black develop, so here the move bishop to f4 is stronger, and here black might continue with this idea of developing the queen side by going bishop to g4, putting pressure on the knight on f3, which is guarding the pawn on e5, and here there's an interesting line for black. After pawn takes, now black can play this move queen to f6, trying to complicate the position as much as possible. Normally when you play gambits, this is what you try to go for. Queen to f6, eyeing the bishop on f4 and the pawn on b2. And here white has to find some unnatural moves to keep the advantage, so here the move queen to c1 is probably white's strongest reply. And after bishop takes and queen takes, black still gets the idea of castling long. So in this position, black might try to claim some compensation. Black has very quick development, but here white might still try to fight for an advantage. Here the move queen to d2 is a move that I like, inviting the queen trade, and then try to catch up with development. So the move d6 is not the most common reply for black in the Englund Gambit. Knight to c6 is more common, but this is probably the trickiest line for black. So if you play it as black, I suggest that you play it. If you play it as white, remember not to take on d6 and continue developing by going knight to f3. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. This will help me a lot. If you want to get a full training plan to improve at chess, feel free to check my free course in the description. That's it for now. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.